Welcome to the New Masculine Podcast. This is a place where masculine identifying people come together in community to disrupt outdated models of masculinity and together construct new models for our way forward as men. As a special note, while this conversation is between men, this podcast values all beings and seeks to create positive impacts for all. I'm your host, Travis Stock. I am a master life coach, an equus coach, which means I often partner with horses when supporting clients, and I'm a teacher. In my coaching work, I am passionate about the balance of masculine and feminine energies in each of us, regardless of gender. I seek to help others nurture a relationship with both types of energy, which often leads to a greater sense of wholeness. And yet what I found in my work with men is that many of us have been taught messages about what it means to be a man by first teaching us to avoid anything that is associated with the feminine. That avoidance leads to few experiences of intimacy, emotions outside of anger, vulnerability, or even a sense of belonging. Striving to comply with these models of masculinity has many of us feeling isolated, ashamed, unworthy, afraid, angry, and depressed. That's why I started this podcast, to bring men together who are ready for something new, something more whole. And I'm so excited to have my first guest here to talk about his journey with masculinity. Michael Trotta also uses coaching to connect others with their unique frequency and genius, their original medicine. He is a father, a mentor, teacher, initiator, and avid fly fisherman. On top of that, he is a close friend of mine and someone who has helped me a great deal in developing my own relationship to the new masculine. Thank you for joining me today, Michael. Is there anything you would add to that introduction?
No, that was beautiful.
So tell me a little bit about how you have viewed masculinity throughout your life.
Even just the question, what is it? What is masculinity? It's one that we're never really asked. What does it mean to be a man? And through our conversations, obviously, we've asked that question. And having worked with men's work and with initiating youth and things like that, I've had the conversation with multiple people, but I have to be honest. I think it's one of those things that elude me. What does it mean to be masculine? So there's I don't even know where to start. Like, it stumped me. We've had this conversation so many times. Can you ask the question again in a different way?
Well, sort of the way that I've been exploring it in my own world is to notice that masculinity is a social construct. It's a collection of norms or ideals that our society or our culture has valued, especially in men. And so it's trying to get us to be masculine. That's what a good man is masculine. And so I guess what I'm really trying to find out from you is, what have you been taught about masculinity growing up? Either very directly by being told that this is what being masculine is, or just by being a part of a culture that touts a certain kind of set of characteristics as masculine.
Right. So what comes to mind with hearing the question that way is a lot of mixed messages about what masculinity is.
Isn't that so true?
Yeah. So with that, a lot of confusion. I was always a very artistic person. I found myself often expressing myself through art, through drawing, through painting. And while those things were often encouraged, to my mind, a lot of those expressions have, because they're often emotion-based, to my mind, they're often feminine, grounded in the feminine, if we were going to put a label to it. And I think in my own experience, it was only safe to push that form of expression so far. And whether it was by a familial pattern, or it was when it came to expressing myself through art, for me, it often always came back to, now what are you going to do with that? you don't express yourself just to express yourself, but I mean, that's nice and all, but if you can make money doing it, right? So that feels to me like by making it something that can become a production, make money, it has this very masculine energy to it. But it was often thrust upon me before I was done even expressing myself, before I even knew what it was that I was trying to say or create. And I think in that I learned, I learned some sort of distortion of both the feminine and masculine within myself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's taking something that naturally expresses out of you and sort of putting it into that capitalistic or patriarchal or masculine sort of modality. And inevitably, when you filter something through a different model, it will distort it.
Right. And I want to be clear. So it's interesting because I've never thought of this particular piece of masculinity. And I think you would agree that that wasn't necessarily a healthy form of the masculine. It was that distorted form.
Correct.
But it defined for me that sort of energy. You don't express yourself as a boy or as a man unless it's going to be productive.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think that the easy way to notice that it's coming through a sort of distorted or immature version of the masculine is when you said something around safety, that it's not safe to just express yourself. You actually have to do something with it. Or that you had internalized that message, that there's a lack of safety in expressing self.
I definitely internalized it, whether it was actually said or not. And the funny thing, as I'm thinking about it now, was it was often the females in my life who pushed the do something with it. And it was the men in my life who, well, they witnessed what I was doing. I don't know that I ever felt like they really saw it or saw me. It was like, oh, good job. That's great. And then on to the next thing. And I was looking for some sort of engagement, a conversation, more than just a compliment. Wow. I've really never thought of any of this in this light before. And it's fascinating.
It's just interesting to notice how didn't matter what the gender of the adult was in front of you. The just expression of self wasn't actually valued. It was either put into now do something with it, which is one of the major sort of archetypes that the masculine is allowed to inhabit, is the provider, earn money, do something with it, make money kind of thing. And yet with men, it was slightly acknowledged, but sort of moved on through quickly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I know this, a part of your story around masculinity is having lost your father at a young age as a child. How do you think that impacted this thing that you're understanding now?
On the whole continuum of my life, I lived in what I'm going to call a very traditional gender rolled, I had my mom and my dad, and they both worked. My mom cooked, my dad cut the lawn. Mom took care of the kids. Dad, I can't even say she was the one who tended to us physically, right? Or, did the laundry and made sure the house was clean and we were fed. And Dad worked, and then he had other forms of work he had on the weekend, and then would play ball with us and did sports. But when he died, I was just turned 12. He was 36. And that really threw me into an awareness of those roles. It also threw me into an awareness of who I was as a male. And it initiated this conversation in me at a very young age. And for that, I'm grateful. Because it is something that, I didn't go into adulthood unaware of the differences. I went into it with my eyes wide open, maybe alone in a lot of ways, but with those questions. What does it mean? And my earliest memory of him dying, even the week he died, I remember there was a number of people who said, well, Mikey, you're the man of the house now. You got to take care of everybody. And I don't think anybody actually meant that I would have to take on any more responsibility, but I think they were meaning to be encouraging. And I remember one of my aunts came up and said, you're still just a little boy. You are not expected to take care of anybody. You're not the man of the house. And again, I know she meant it in a loving way, but I remember it made me so angry that she would call me a little boy and that she didn't think I was up to the task. And at that point, having a younger brother and a younger sister, I was determined to be the man of the house. And to be honest with you, what I think happened was I took my mother's role and she became the man of the house. You know, she went back to school. She worked full time. I did the laundry. I kept the house clean. I helped with the meals. And then when I was a little bit older, I drove the kids to soccer and to tutoring. And I kind of consciously or unconsciously took on that more traditional mom role. I was a soccer mom at 16 years old, which actually continued, I think, aided in my exploration of what is male and what is female, which is probably why I don't think I walked the traditional masculine, you know, get a job out of college and build up your stock portfolio. And I don't know, maybe that's not traditional, but you know what I mean? Like,
yeah. Well, I think it's interesting as you were talking about how the different adults in your life handled that time in your life and how in many ways, even though people were trying to do well by you and trying to support you, in some ways you felt painted into a corner. You weren't a kid, but you also weren't man enough. And so it was this place where you were in this box and had to find your own way as a 12-year-old. That's a lot to take on.
Yep. I remember it being really confusing. Like, I didn't have anybody that was necessarily mentoring me or guiding me into what it meant to be a man or even to be myself. But I was actively looking outside of myself for examples. And for better or worse, one example was a guidance counselor who was just super kind to me. I could tell that he was trying to be that guidance. And then he passed away in a car accident. So it was like this other kind of blow. And then for the most part, the rest of what I had around me, I'm going to say was a lot of shadow masculine, those really, sort of stereotypical darker sides of masculinity. And that were about, having sex with women and as many as you can and kind of locker room, immature masculine talk. But from adult men that I was around and would overhear or be spoken to directly. And I remember it both feeling really wrong and definitely not having the foundation to say you're wrong. I mean, I was just a kid, so it's like, okay, that's what it is then. I want to be a man.
Yeah.
And it took years to kind of untangle from that.
Which I think is so the reason for this conversation that we're having, that you and I have been having for a long time, but also now what we're sort of sharing with other people is that most of us have those outdated models of masculinity that are about taking power, that are about sex with a lot of different people, that are about the shadow side of the masculine, or the masculine that's overly used and not balanced, not with its own integrated feminine space. And so I think that's the point of this conversation. And so as I hear you talking about some of the things that you integrated as a child, now that you, as you said, the death of your father sort of initiated you into this conversation with yourself about what is masculine, what is feminine, what are male, female roles. How would you say that your personal ideals around masculinity have changed?
I feel like they've more put me at a distance from a definition of what that role is. And what I mean by that is, at that young age, before I really was a man, of course I was male, but I wasn't a man in my identity. What it did was it put me into a liminal space that in a lot of ways I have not left. And not necessarily for a bad thing. They put me in that space where I just say, is that true? Is that what a man is? When you were describing the outdated, older model of masculinity, it was an unconscious model. That's what it was. And when I think about the men in my life back then and how they were, I don't feel it right to blame them, because it feels to me like they were a product of the masculinity that came before. And that's not to excuse them. It just means there was an unconsciousness. But I felt awake to it, and not better than or right, just like questioning. And so that's been where I think it's fair to say where I've been with masculinity. When the topic comes up, when I see something play out in front of me or hear a story that has that sort of outdated version of masculinity, or even something new and tender and beautiful as an expression of masculinity, I naturally kind of sit back and say, what's in that for me? What do I have to learn about masculinity from that, rather than say it's right or wrong, or have a judgment stamped on it.
Yeah, what I hear in that is that some of your childhood experiences put you into a place of questioning what was modeled to you.
Yep.
And in that questioning, you had choice, and you continue to have choice. And in order to have choice, you have to be sort of conscious. You can't be asleep to the patterns or to the old models. You have to be awake enough to sort of start asking questions, getting curious, and even choosing for yourself rather than choosing what was given to you.
Yeah. And since you said that, I want to be fair that there has been a lot of things that I woke up to a consciousness around the traditional masculine and feminine, a man and a woman, and how they relate to one another. But in more recent years, where I did find my edges and have kind of started to see, wow, I'm no different than those guys who I was looking up to when it comes to masculinity as it relates to men with different gender issues, different sexuality. I don't know what the word is. Topics, not preferences. Those aren't the right words. Maybe you can help me. But if you use like transgender folks as an example, 10 years, I don't know that I even really knew it was a real thing, that somebody would identify as different than how they were born. And I probably would have and did speak, like it was 1978, and would use terminology that was common to that time. And fortunately, I have been blessed to meet a number of transgender people who, in getting to know them, kind of put me into relationship with my own, like I said, blind spots, shortcoming. And fortunately, because I had so much practice kind of questioning as it relates to how I grew up, I was able to put that practice back into use, that questioning, and say, what is here for me to learn now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important thing to talk about is that in the new masculine, in sort of where we're headed as men, I really want there to be some safety around the fact that none of us are going to do this perfectly. None of us are going to know everything about it now, and we're going to continue to expand our knowledge around this and our sort of embodiment of it. I know there's plenty of places, even as a gay man, where for myself, where I internalized a lot of homophobia. I internalized a lot of rejection of people in my own community. And I can remember playing games as kids that were sort of derogatory towards gay people. And I played them willingly and happily. It wasn't until I started to own my own experience and to really find who I really am and to continue to question and to continue to have choice that I started finding who I am now and showing up in the way that I am now. So I think that's a common journey for many of us, is that we do the best we can at the space that we're at, and we continue to evolve and continue to do better. And I think that's something I want to really infuse into the conversations that I'm having with people on this podcast. Is it's not about perfection, but it is about curiosity. It is about questioning. It is about choice. And it is about being aware of where we've been patterned in ways that are unconscious and finding new ways that are more conscious and that are more that have a greater impact positively for everyone around us.
Yeah. So can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So from that place, where do you stand, or what do you think about when we as men are now often in a position where we are questioning our behavior from years ago? I'm thinking of the Me Too movement and movements like it, where women are finally having a voice, standing up, showing us that behaviors of the past are unacceptable. And I see a lot of value in it, and I'm really grateful for it. And I also see a lot of resistance to it, because it's going back 10, even 20, 30 years saying, hey, look, this is what happened. And is there room for that conversation and for forward movement from that place? Like, what does it take for a man who maybe is being given an opportunity to face his behaviors from the past today?
Yeah, it's an important question. And it's something that I am exploring in myself. It's why I'm opening this conversation with this podcast, is because I do see a lot of people, a lot of women especially, having the conversation around tearing down the patriarchy and toxic masculinity and behaviors of the past that were oppressive and that keep people out of power and keep them in power. I think those are super valid and appropriate conversations to be having. And I think the anger behind them is really important as well. The space that I want to hold in this conversation is actually a place where there's a container that has a lot of psychological safety embedded within it, so that we can look back at our behaviors with a questioning eye to start looking at how did that work? How did that feel to other people? How do we have empathy for the experiences that we have created for people?
Yeah.
And then how do we use that to inform ourselves to do better? What I keep seeing happening is that a lot of men don't feel psychologically safe enough to do that work. The shame comes up, or the anger comes up, or the guilt comes up. Something emotionally comes up that they're not equipped to handle or navigate, because we as men are not really given permission to have any level of emotional maturity in our culture. And then there's just a digging heels in even more and shutting down to another's perspective, or shutting off that piece of empathy that would allow someone to really take a look at those past experiences. So I want there to be space for this conversation to be had in many different ways, but the space I want to hold with it is like, let's look at that stuff. Let's remove the shame aspect from it, and let's look at what we can learn from it. Let's look at how was that serving us back then, and how do we actually want to step forward in a way that serves a more holistic aspect of ourselves? What is it like for you? I think that in some ways, a piece of privilege that I have as a gay man is that I feel very safe as a man, that I know that I'm not typically looked at as a man that is crossing boundaries or that is going to be wrapped up in the Me Too movement. As a heterosexual man, how does this conversation that's going on in our culture impact you?
Yeah. I think the way it impacts me, or the place where I struggle most with it, is simply there's not a quick fix. I think as a man, you want to talk about masculinity. We like, and I'm generalizing here, of course, but for the conversation, we like to fix things. It's like, I think it's in our DNA. And one of the things I kind of continually learn from my wife is she doesn't necessarily want me to fix it. She just wants me to witness. And that's really goes back to the doing of childhood in my art, right? No, you can't feel something without doing something. And I'm constantly, let's just listen. And so with this conversation about, let's just say, past transgressions, while I'm not really all that concerned that somebody's going to come out and say I did something that I would be deeply ashamed of, although I know I haven't been an angel my whole life, I think what I struggle with it, like conversations about, say, cultural appropriation, is that there isn't a quick fix. There isn't a do these 5 steps and it's all better. There isn't a magic pill to take. There's grief and shame and uncertainty woven in the conversation. And men in general are not comfortable sitting in that space because they want to know there's an end game and a plan and a way out. And I don't know that is what we have in these kind of conversations, at least not now.
I think that is so true, how we as men are trained to be very solution oriented. And we can't sit in a conversation for the development process. We have to be looking for the solution or the fix to the problem. And I think what you're pointing out that is so important for us as men to be really owning and developing in ourselves is our ability to listen.
Yep.
Our ability to be in the tension, to be in the discomfort, to listen to the stories of others as a way of increasing our empathy, our understanding of our impact on others, our impact on this planet. And in that listening, we actually can be more present with people and actually create more safety for ourselves, for each other, for this planet.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. What was coming to mind as you're talking, you'd said something, and it just triggered this kind of thought. The other part of this, I think, that I'm coming to is how things culturally are changing so much more rapidly than they ever have. And part of the struggle is that it can take time to figure out what masculinity is to you, who you are as a man in a solid, stable culture. But in one that's constantly shifting and changing, I think currently it's very difficult for men of a certain age to make the change at the same speed. I do think men of a younger age are able to adapt more quickly because that's the model that they've grown up with. When I watch, 20-somethings and younger have conversations about these sort of things, certain topics that are we're talking about here are like, just, of course, that's the way it is to them. What's the big deal? And here I am having this big conversation about men caring for one another or feeling emotion, and I'm not saying the problem is fixed. I'm just saying it seems like a younger generation is more prepared for evolution and change than men who are a bit older, who kind of have an awareness of how their fathers were and their grandfathers were, and even further back, where they were probably more the same than what's in front of them.
It definitely makes sense. And I think part of what plays into that is sort of, it's a very naturally a developmentally appropriate thing to have sort of more of a pliable brain at a younger age, and to be focused on expansion rather than focused on the direction you're headed necessarily. You don't necessarily, as a young person, know your whole life trajectory. And so developmentally, you're sort of absorbing a lot more at that point and willing to absorb more. I think something that's in there that everyone can learn from, though, is that in the sort of bumping into all different kinds of people and diversity and different ideas and different mindsets, we actually can evolve our own thinking by being in that space of curiosity and listening to others who have different experiences of ours.
Yes. And what's interesting to me now as I'm thinking is that in order to define masculinity, we always have to bring femininity into it.
I was going to ask you, what do you think is the role of the feminine within our conversation about where masculinity is heading?
Right. My definition or reason for even defining masculinity in relationship to femininity is to have the conversation. But I don't think one or the other has to be assigned to an individual. I think there's a continuum and a blend. But bringing that back to what I was saying before, and while there, I'm sure there were exceptions. The conversation about femininity didn't really begin until the suffragettes, right? So that's at least to my knowledge, one of our first real moments in history where we started to even have on a cultural level the conversation about women being seen and heard and valued, and it came from them demanding it. And then in the 60s and 70s, we had a kind of another wave with Gloria Steinem and others, and that followed sort of an awakening of men having this conversation. Very, very small, certainly not a mass cultural thing, but there was definitely men's groups and circles and things that started to have these conversations. So I just think it's important to acknowledge that the conversation about masculinity, the divine masculine, emotional maturity didn't even begin until I was a kid, and I only am aware of that now as an adult, that, because of some of my heroes who were the starters of this conversation 30, 40 years ago. And so my point is, I didn't really grow up with this conversation. It wasn't until I was in my 30s that I started having it. And that was 20 years ago. But I am seeing, and from the initiatory practices and ceremonies and things like that I've led, younger boys and men are having these conversations on a larger scale. And that's really, really encouraging. And I think I agree with you. It plays into the pliability of the brain and all of that. But culturally speaking, it is happening. And by and large, men over, let's say, 30 or 40, it's not happening on a large scale just yet.
Yeah. And I think that's why we're having this conversation here.
Absolutely.
To have it on a bigger scale.
Super important.
You started bringing up your sort of initiator, mentor, teacher role that you play, and sort of where you're noticing this conversation happening a little bit more. Can you share with me a little more detail about how you are bringing in your consciousness around masculinity, how you're bringing in this conversation into your mentorship, into your teaching roles, into your initiation roles?
Sure. Well, as you know, where you do a lot of your coaching with horses, in my own work, I've been using nature connection, connecting children and adults with an awareness of the cycles of nature through nature-based skills and practices. And I think the natural world is an incredible blend of those energies that we're talking about. And it lends itself really well to conversation about what is feminine and what is masculine, because we can see it playing out metaphorically in front of us. An initiation, the actual word, means an introduction to the knowledge of. And for the bulk of human history, at the time of the beginning of adolescence, young men and women were initiated. They were introduced to the knowledge of. And one of those things that they were introduced to was their genius or their gift or their medicine, the thing that makes them uniquely them, as well as an awareness of what I would say of the self, of that part of you that is not your parents. And in connecting with that, you start to realize that you're not the center of the universe. And when you're introduced to that, another thing that was often introduced was, and most likely because we were coming into puberty at that time, our sexuality was for men masculinity and for women femininity. And in my own work, because the boys are at that age, that is where we introduce the question, well, what does it mean to be a man? And we introduce the question, we don't provide an answer, which I think is key. We ask the youth to dig in deep and to have this conversation that you and I are having now so that they can do it for the rest of their lives. All of that rather than say, this is what a man does. This is how a man acts. This is, a lot of the offering them the unconscious definitions that I was given about what a man is and does. And the conversation is had in a circle of men.
I think that is such a powerful way for future generations undoing sort of the unconscious masculinity that's taught, is to be in the development phase with people, to be in that space where you ask the question but don't give them the answer. I think, and for a long time we've been telling children how to act and how to be and who to be. And I think in what you're sharing is that you're actually asking them to do the work of answering those questions for themselves.
Yes. I have a quick story. It just came to mind. I remember being at one of these initiations, without giving too much away. We used to have an oath that we would lead the new initiates through. They would give an oath, because that was all often and almost always a part of an initiation. It's a claiming of who you are moving forward, and you're claiming the same thing that had been claimed by a long lineage of those whose shoulders you stand upon. And when I took the oath and when I had heard it, I was very proud to take it. And I remember this one year we were doing the initiation and the oath was offered, and it was optional. It was a choice. And there was this young guy who I would have described as very much in touch with his feminine side. He was, to see him next to his peers, you'd be like, you can see femininity in him. And he wouldn't take the oath. And I remember everybody was like, what? He's not taking the oath. He's not, he just wasn't going along with it. And because of his courage to say, no, I can't be in my integrity and agree to those things. And he did it with absolute respect. He just declined. That it forced us leaders to go back and look at that oath and really try to understand what it was that this kid said no to. And it was this outdated mode of masculinity. It was this, I don't remember exactly what the phrase was, but it was something like, I promise to be the protector and something else. It was very macho, which was what was appealing to us men wanting to be macho. But this kid was saying, yeah, I can't promise that all the time. Which again leads me to, as a man in midlife, I guess you could say, I think there is a lot to learn from the younger generations about masculinity, femininity, sexuality, gender identity, gender fluidity. If we can just get out of our own way and loosen our grip on that traditional kind of shadowy versions of those things, and just pay attention and ask questions and see what the younger generations have to teach us about our own blind spots, we can move forward into a much healthier expression of both masculine and feminine and whatever lies in between, or whatever the two are when they come together. And even in that, and I'm saying this because I've watched older people sort of bristle at that idea. Nothing can replace the wisdom and vision that comes with age, but it needs to be used in a way that can see what we have to learn from younger people as well as older people, and not think that we have the answers as just because we've lived longer, because shit's changing.
Yeah, I think the reality is it needs to be bi-directional. The information and the wisdom needs to go back and forth. And I love what you're bringing up around sort of listening to the younger generation, because we are in an interesting time where the gender binary is being deconstructed, sexuality is being deconstructed, and people are starting to be able to identify not as labels or within certain boxes, but more fluidly, more on the spectrum, identifying as they want to identify, not as they're being told to identify or what are the few options that are given to them. And I think that I'm so glad you brought it up, because it's such an important part of the conversation that I want to be having is that, yes, we are men having this conversation, and we're using language that is on the binary sort of scale, masculine, feminine.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I think the goal that I have, and I think I hear this in you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's actually more of the continuum basis. It is actually more about helping us each find our ability to play in both spaces, to play in all spaces, to not necessarily have to prescribe to a set of behaviors just because you are a man, but to have access to everything.
To not be threatened by someone who's exploring where they are. I've watched people have that. You know, you hear from younger people a lot. I do anyway. You know, I don't identify that way or identify this way, and it's not in the traditional male or female. That is not a threat against your own sexuality. And I'm not going to say I've never felt it as, you know, I have felt it as a threat when I first started hearing those words, or I would roll my eyes. Oh, I don't identify. Come on, give me a break. Until I started to loosen my grip on those, you know, binary, it has to be this or the other. And it's funny, I listened to something on NPR, I think it was not too long ago, where it was with a gay woman who talked about her struggles coming up and what that was like. And then these two younger people who didn't identify expressed themselves while in conversation with her. And she just was like, well, I don't understand about any of that. And it just stood out to me as a moment of, just because somebody doesn't identify as the same way as you do, it's not a threat against what you knew. No, just ask a question. Well, what's that like for you? Tell me more about it. It's that easy.
It's so fascinating how we can't let people's experiences be what they are. They have to agree with our experience of reality. And that is something that I think is such an important part that you keep bringing up is that it's about allowing and listening to others. Others can have other experience, and it doesn't have to mean anything about your identity, your experience of the world. And listening creates empathy. If you can hear someone else's experience and hear why and ask questions and get curious about somebody else's experience, then you might be more enriched. You might continue to be able to grow and expand as a human being as well.
But you have to lean into that fear place, because I think, and I can't imagine, I mean, I can only really speak from my own experience, but I think it's the reason why so many of us can't accept another person's experiences, because we immediately go to, well, what does that say about me? I don't want to know what that means about me, because what might we find? And how do we create safety? And yes, through conversations like this for sure, where it's not such a threat to find out who you really are.
That what might I find out? That's such an interesting thing, how somebody else's identity can create a fear within yourself about your own identity, or about what you might find if you were actually willing to question and allow a more authentic expression to come through you.
Yeah.
And I think that's a part of the outdated models of masculinity that's there, is that there are scarcity models around power, around self-identification, around who gets what and who gets to decide what reality is. And I love the concept that we're talking about being able to give the power back to everyone. Everyone gets their own sense of power and identity and their own ability to construct reality for themselves. Now, I think that there's sort of ways of being with each other that create communal standards and ways of being that help us all stay safe that I think need to be in place. But in giving power back to every one of us and actually being willing to listen, we can actually all grow and expand. But it is about sitting in that tension you talked about.
Yeah. And couldn't that be the identity, though? The group identity. Our group identity is that we are willing to accept that everybody has their own individual understanding and expression. I know there's biological reasons for why we need to identify. Question that's coming to mind is, are we going to be able to transcend those biological imperatives of tribalism?
Yeah. And I can't wait for future episodes of this podcast because I already have some people lined up that do identify a little less on the binary or that are trans and that have had to navigate masculinity in a different way than even you or I have. And so while we are having a conceptual conversation, having people that live that experience and being able to share what that experience is to help enrich this conversation. And I can't wait to involve more of those conversations because I know, as you've been talking about sort of that initiatory process that you lead with people, even just yours and my friendship has been a big initiation process for me. And I don't know that, I'm not saying that you entered into it consciously or that I entered into it consciously, but that just our friendship has in many ways initiated me into a deeper understanding of masculinity. For much of my childhood and teenage years and then into my 20s, I had such a complicated relationship with masculinity and femininity. In parts of my life, I was rejecting everything feminine because it was what announced to the world that I was gay, and I couldn't hide in that, and I didn't feel safe in that. And then as I started to come to terms with my own identity, I actually started pushing masculinity out and saying, well, that's not safe. And I've only ever seen the models of it that are profane and that are unconscious and that are about taking power from others. So then I started to push that away and found myself quite depressed and quite melancholy most of my 20s.
Yeah.
And it was sort of your first when you traveled to California and came and stayed in my place with me, where I actually had to confront some of that. I actually started to really look at there are powerful benefits and there are divine aspects of the masculine that I want to embody for myself and that I want to live in. That doesn't mean that I become what was modeled to me. It means I get to own my own strength and own my own value within the feminine aspects of myself, but I also get to thrive within the masculine as well. And so your relationship with me has been a big initiatory process in me and allowing me to step forward as a man who also has a very sort of powerful spot within the feminine. And I am so grateful that your style and the way that you show up in the world and sort of one of your missions has also positively impacted me, whether you were conscious of it or not.
I think we dug so many holes and had so many conversations that I was very conscious of it. And I feel likewise. I think I've expressed that before and I will do it here. Yeah, it was a meeting you and those early years, it was a real turning point for me, or a deepening. Maybe that's a better word. It took me from a place where I think I plateaued in my growth around masculinity and projected me deeper into an understanding, into layers that I could not have done on my own or with even the straight men who I was already in conversation about this stuff with.
Yeah, I think that that's the unique gift of being people that identify differently, but that find commonality is that in many ways, you opened up a space for me to heal some of my wounding around the masculine. And in other ways, I opened up space for you to integrate more of your feminine qualities and to value and see the power in that.
Yes. And to heal wounds around those areas too that needed healing.
Yeah. So as we sort of wrap up this conversation, I want to challenge you to see if you could come up with one piece of advice that you would give to men moving forward. I know it's a tough one. I know it's a big one. As you sit and think about it for a moment, what comes up for me that I've had now a couple of conversations recently as I've been sort of in the development process with this podcast is for men to remain curious. Can you remain open? Can you remain curious about others? And in that curiosity, my hope is that more empathy will be developed, will be valued. And I think that creates safety for all. Anything you would add or anything you would?
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I was going to say right before you said it. And to piggyback on what I was saying, it's not so much advice as it is a challenge, because there is so much in the media and in entertainment now that's addressing these things, this conversation, to notice where you feel that tinge of judgment or fear around something that is unfamiliar to you or that you have resisted in whatever way. And when you feel that, take a step back and just ask a question, like, what am I being offered here? What is this trying to teach me? What is there for me to learn? And even more so if it's with an actual person, to ask, what is that like for you?
Yeah. That when you feel that you don't have to run away from it, doesn't mean something's gone wrong. It means that this is your doorway and opening to your growth.
It's an opportunity to grow. Yeah, man, it's amazing what can happen if you just don't resist it.
Totally. Well, I'm so grateful that you joined me for this first episode of the New Masculine podcast. If people wanted to find out more about the work you're doing in the world or wanted to connect with you, do you want to share any more information about how they might do that?
Yeah, they can find me at sagefirementoring.com, SAGEFIRE, mentoring. The majority of my work is around initiating the gifts in people, helping them identify what makes them uniquely them so that they can live from that place, so that they can build a business or a career, doing the thing that they most love, applying their gift to it, and making the world a better place for doing it.
I love that. And I think something I've seen in your recent emails and the newsletters that you've been putting out is that you have some 5-minute videos that are coming out that people can access for free to sort of understand a little bit more of your style, and then potentially sign up for more if they are into it.
Yeah, they'll find those on the homepage of my website. They're called 5-Minute Mojo Makeovers. Really just to kind of explore this idea that we each have our own unique signature or frequency, and there's just simple everyday things you can do so that you can be grounded in your power and your frequency and your truth, enjoy life a whole lot more, and find connection with other people because you're doing it.
I'd also love to hear from any of the listeners of this podcast regarding any questions you have or any ways you want to participate in the conversation that we're having. You can reach me at my website at travisstock.com. That's TravisStock.com. You can connect with me on Instagram at Travers03, TRAVERS03, or you can email me directly at travisstock03@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.